Chapter 9 33 hours, 30 minutes, 29.8 seconds. Friday in the sky. Take off behind him. Charles lined up his compass and set his course. Heading across Long Island Sound, he flew toward Connecticut. A newspaper plane soared up beside him. Cameras stuck out cockpit and cabin windows. He stiffened in his seat. It had never occurred to him that newspaper companies would hire a plane to follow him. He willed it to go away. As he crossed into Connecticut, he got his wish. After dipping its wing in farewell, the plane turned and soared off. The sky belonged to the spirit of St. Louis. Charles flew on, and by late afternoon, he'd passed over Rhode Island and Massachusetts and was winging his way toward Nova Scotia. The sun came out, warming up the cockpit. It made Charles awake for more than 24 hours, groggy. He unzipped his blanket-lined flying suit and took a sip of water from his canteen. It would be pleasant to doze off for a few seconds, but I mustn't feel sleepy at this point, he scolded himself. Why, I'm less than feel sleepy at this point, he scolded himself. Why, I'm less than a tenth of the way to Paris. There's still the rest of today and all of tonight and tomorrow and part of maybe all of tomorrow night. At noon, Nova Scotia appeared. As the forest-thick landscape passed beneath his wings, he reached for one of the 5 sandwiches he'd brought along. No, he thought, drawing his hand back, why eat when he wasn't hungry? He'd save it just in case he was forced down at sea. His legs began to cramp. He tried to ignore it, knowing his muscles' complaints would grow worse over the next few hours. Eventually, though, his legs would get accustomed to their bent position. the pain would subside. He felt he kept himself busy. Every hour he would need to adjust the lever regulating the flow of gasoline from one tank to another. He kept a mark on his instrument panel for each changeover. He also entered hourly notations on his log sheet, marking speed, altitude, and other data. And then there was the spirit's instability. It required his constant attention to stay on course. 4 hours later, Nova Scotia was behind him, but now his eyes felt dry and hard. Keeping them open seemed impossible. Sleep was winning. He let them close for a moment before forcing them open again. The sun was starting to set. Hours of darkness lay ahead, and thousands of miles of ocean. How would he get through the night without falling asleep? He forced himself to focus on stick and sky and the rumbling of his engine. He was now he was over Newfoundland now, the last point on the island, the last point on the last island of North America, the end of land. The end of day, he realized. Sacrificing some of his precious fuel, he veered slightly off course and circled low over the little town of St. John's. Men on the wharves looked up, pointed, waved. He wanted to see him. If he got lost over the Atlantic, at least people would know he'd made it this far. Then he turned his plane toward the open sea and the blackness of night. Ireland lay 2,000 miles ahead. Friday on the ground. Something like a miracle was taking place across America. No sooner had word flashed across the wires that Charles had taken off than 100 million people were suddenly seized with hope and yearning. Young and old, rich and poor, farmer and stockbroker, churchgoer and skeptic, everyone fastened their attention on the young man in the spirit of St. Louis. Would Charles Lindbergh make it? Could he? In the minds of the public, his flight had taken on epic proportions. Not only would his success be a source of national pride, but it would also be an achievement for all mankind. Imagine it. Because of Lindbergh, the world would be changed. People could People, countries, continents once separated from each other would be brought together by flight. Everyone would be within reach. And bo- this boy, really, was doing it alone. The sheer audacity of it took people's breath away. All along Charles's early route, people climbed into trees and onto roofs or gathered on the street to catch a glimpse of his plane. They huddled before radios and in front of newspaper offices to hear or read the latest flash bulletin. In New York City, a crowd mobbed Times Square, expecting reports of Lindbergh's progress to be posted on the side of the trees on the side of the Times Square building. When information didn't come fast enough, people telephoned the newspaper, 10,000 calls in total. And as the hours passed, reports trickled in. Lindbergh had been sighted over Connecticut, Massachusetts, Nova Scotia. Across the nation, in factories, stores, restaurants, and homes, atlases were opened and maps tacked up on walls so the earthbound could envision his route. Night fell and the public turned sober. No attempt at jokes today, wrote America's famous cowboy humorist Will Rogers in his syndicated newspaper column. A slim, bashful, smiling American boy is somewhere over the middle of the Atlantic Ocean where no lone human being has ever ventured before. If he is lost, it will be the most universally regretted loss we've ever had. Several radio stations broadcast a new song written and sung by the trio, the Bonnie Laddies. So moved were listening audiences that the lyrics were printed in newspapers coast to coast. The next morning, Captain Lindbergh, we're with you. Won't you please come smiling through? Keep her going, give her the steam. You'll soon reach the land of your dreams. And in Yankee Stadium, two heavyweight boxers, Jim Maloney and Jack And Jack Sharkey fought before a crowd of 40,000. Suddenly, a bow-tied announcer stopped the action and stepped into the pool of light in the center of the darkness. Rise to your feet and think about a boy up there tonight who is carrying the hopes of all true-blooded Americans, he said. As one, the entire crowd stood and bowed their heads. For a full minute they kept quiet before Sharkey knocked out Maloney. In little towns and big cities, wherever people gathered, they prayed for their hero. It was all they could do. But by sending a few words heavenward, many felt they'd become part of his journey. Night flight. It was pitch dark, the sky thick with mountains of clouds. Feeling lonely, Charles once again sacrificed some fuel to climb above them. Up, up, up he ascended until at last, at 5,000 feet, stars pierced the haze. A feeling of security washed over him. The stars have always been there, he thought. As long as I can hold on to them, I'll be safe. With his eyes on them, his mind wandered back to his boyhood days. It was as if he were traveling with their twinkling vision, back and forth through time. His head nodded. His eyelids felt heavy. Suddenly he noticed how cold it had gotten inside the cockpit. He snapped back to attention. At this altitude, cold meant ice that could deform the shape of a wing, weigh down a plane and force it into the sea. He pulled his flashlight from his pocket and shined it out the side window. A pillow of clouds had closed over the stars. At their edges he felt shiny, thread-like streaks. He shined the light on one of the Spirit's struts. Ice already coated it. Charles was fully awake now. His first instinct was to dive steeply toward warmer air. But the Spirit was too sensitive for that. It required careful flying every minute. As the plane bounced, buffeted by sudden strong winds, he maneuvered out of the ice clouds and into clear air. He flew shining the light on wings and struts again and again. At last, the ice melted and fell away. Charles relaxed, and once again sleep threatened. He had to stay awake. He had to keep his eyes open. But after 16 hours in the air and almost 39 hours without sleep, all he wanted was to close them. Fighting the urge, he stuck his hand out the side window, diverting a strong gust of air into his face. He took deep, gulping breaths and let his eyelids fall shut for a few seconds, then tried to raise them. But they weighed too much. He didn't have the strength. After forcing one open with a thumb, he lifted the muscles on his forehead to hold it in place. One hand on the stick, the other on his face, he flew on. 5 more hours in the air. 5 more hours without sleep. He no longer felt attached to his body. It was as if he were an automation flying mechanically. An automaton. It was as if he were an automaton flying mechanically. Both hands were now on the stick, his feet on the rudder, and his eyes on the compass. But his consciousness, like a winged messenger, soared from the cockpit, skimmed the white caps of the ocean below, played in the clouds. At one point he jerked back into his body to discover he'd fallen asleep with his eyes open. Terrified of what might have happened, he descended until he was just above the ocean, close enough for cold spray from the waves to moisten his face. He shook his head until it hurt. 22 hours into his flight, the ghosts came. Vaguely outlined forms, transparent, moving, riding weightless with me in the plane, he later said. They filled the fuselage behind him. Charles felt no surprise at seeing them. He felt no fear. These phantoms weren't strangers. They were more like a gathering family and friends after years of separation. He felt he'd known them all in some past incarnation. The ghosts spoke with human voices. First one and then another pressed forward and leaned into his ear so as to be heard above the engine. What did they say? Charles never told, but their words, he believed, were gifts, special knowledge not shared with ordinary mortals. He felt his body disintegrate and reform. He felt his mind expand beyond its. He felt his mind expand beyond its. He felt his mind expand beyond its solid walls of bone to the immortal existence that lies outside. He felt reconstructed, reincarnated. Death no longer seems the final end it used to be, but rather the entrance to a new and free existence, which includes all space, all time. I live in the past, the present, the future, here, and in different places all at once. Vistas open up before me as changing as those between the clouds I pass. I'm flying in a plane over the Atlantic Ocean, but I'm also living in years now far away. The spirits until the spirits stayed until the night's darkness lifted and the early morning mist faded. And like the mythical phoenix, reborn and renewed, the spirit of St. Louis burst into dazzling sunlight. Saturday morning in America. Below on Earth, Americans awoke clamoring for news of their hero. Of course, there wasn't any. Charles had been out of touch for hours and would continue to be until he reached Ireland. What papers lacked in real news, they made up for with editorial cartoons, tributes, and special photo sections. But it was a cartoon by St. Louis Dispatch artist Daniel R. Fitzpatrick depicting a wide empty sea and and an immense gloomy sky that best summed up the nation's emotions. In the middle of this desolate desolate picture, looking both defiant and pathetic, a solitary plane flew. The second day, Charles was more than 2 hours ahead of schedule. Miraculously, a tall wind a tailwind had whipped up just after his ghostly visitors departed. Even more astonishing, he felt alert and strong again. It was as if he'd recovered from a serious illness. Hands on the stick, eyes on the horizon, he pondered his otherworldly experience. He believed he would unravel its deeper meaning in time, but discovery would have to wait. Now in his 27th hour of flight, Charles could see the coast of Ireland. Haze-covered hills, clumps of trees, rocky cliffs. Ireland was a glorious sight. As the spirit of St. Louis soared above villages, people streamed into the streets, waving and waving. Thought Charles, for 25 years I've lived on earth and yet not seen it till this moment. On he flew. Daylight was fading when he saw the coast of France. One more hour to Paris, he told himself. In celebration, he ate one of his sandwiches, his first food in more than 35 hours. It didn't taste all that good, but he chewed, swallowed it down, then gulped some water. He didn't have to conserve that anymore. He crumpled up the sandwich wrapper and started to throw it out the window. At the last second, he thought better of it and stuffed it back in the bag. I didn't want to litter from a sandwich to symbolize. I didn't want the litter from a sandwich to symbolize my first contact with France. Soon he picked up the patterned lights of Paris's streets and the Eiffel Tower. He circled it, of course. Then he headed northeast toward Le Bourget Airport. He thought he saw it, but what was happening with his light? With its lights? They made no sense. There was a black square framed by regularly spaced lights, but on one side the airfield was a jam of erratic light. He circled over the black square and circled again. More of the airfield revealed itself. Those erratic lights, he realized, were the headlights of automobiles stuck in traffic. Why would they put the airport so close to the city? He circled the square a third time, choosing a spot for his landing. He pulled back on the stick, closed the throttle, his wheels touched the ground, and the Spirit bounced and rolled, at last coming to a stop in the middle of the dark field. It was 10:24 p.m. in Paris, 33 and a half hours since he'd left New York, and 2.5 hours ahead of his schedule. Suddenly, out of the blackness surged a wall of people, arms waving, shouting, crying, frenzied. The first to reach him were airport workmen. Sete voiskava, they shouted. This time it's done. Charles shouted back, "Are there any mechanics here?" His words were lost in the pandemonium. Wave after wave of people kept coming, more than 150,000 in all, breaking down the barricades set up by the government, surging onto the field. Charles opened the cockpit door and tried to put his foot on the ground, but dozens of hands grabbed him. They lifted him into the air, then passed him around over the heads of the cheering mob. It was like drowning in a human sea, he recalled. In the chaos, two French pilots found themselves close to him. "Come," said one to the other, "they will smother him." Snatching the helmet of Charles' head, they slapped it onto a tall American reporter, pointed at him, and shouted in French, "There is Lindbergh!" The crowd dropped the real Lindbergh and surged after the startled impostor. Meanwhile, Charles's rescuers linked their arms around him and began moving him unnoticed through the crowd. Charles protested. He needed to go back and make sure the Spirit was safe, but the pilots promised the plane would be taken care of. They bundled him into a nearby car and drove him to a quiet hangar on the other side of the field. 2 hours passed before the American ambassador to France, Myron T. Herrick, found him. "Young man," he said, "I'm going to take you home with me to the embassy and look after you." Charles was grateful, but he couldn't leave until he'd seen his plane. It took another hour for the crowds to disperse. Then Charles's French rescuers drove him to the hangar where the Spirit had been stored. Shocked, Charles ran his hand over the plane's frame. Souvenir hunters had torn it apart, gaping holes pockmarked its fuselage and fittings from its engine had vanished along with the flight log. Still, a careful inspection showed no serious damage. A little repair could a little repair would make it airworthy again. After leaving the Spirit protected by policemen in the hangar, Charles got back into the car with his rescuers. And then, after battling both traffic jams and people dancing in Paris's streets, after visiting the Arc de Triomphe and the tomb of the unknown soldier, the French pilot's idea, not his own, after eating a light supper of Bouillon, Bouillon, and an egg, after ba- Bouillon and an egg, after bathing and putting on a pair of the ambassador's too short pajamas, after giving a brief interview to the reporters who clogged the street in front of the American embassy, the ambassador's idea, not his own, Charles finally climbed into the narrow twin bed in the embassy's guest room and closed his eyes. It was 4:15 in the morning. He had been awake 63 hours.